In what way did the legacy of World War II play out in the years following the final conclusion of the conflict? Although we tend to think of World War II as a good war, in which the peace-loving Americans reluctantly joined war to destroy the evil Nazis, it was far more complex and multifaceted than this. As a result, the following years of the war were a strange fog of confusion as the survivors tried to deal with its legacy and build a new world out of the ashes. And we see this happening in three main ways. Firstly, in that military innovations changed our perspective on good and evil. Secondly, we see this as a reconstruction of the world in America's image, as the losers were compelled to imitate the winners. And lastly, we see it doing this by leaving permanent psychological scars on the victims that participated in it. Let's first start by looking at how it changed our perspectives on good and evil. Now, today, we automatically assume anything related to do with the Nazi Party is evil. And this is not without reason. Take, for example, the story of P.G. Wodehouse. He was a famous British officer living in France during the time of the Nazi invasion. And unfortunately, he was captured and sent to the concentration camp at Tostes. However, he was luckier than most, as an officer there soon recognized him and told him to start writing. So Wodehouse complied and even denied special housing, endearing him to many of the fellow prisoners and officers. However, before long, the secret police found out, and they gave him an offer. His wife, who he had been separated from, would avoid any sort of accidents if Wodehouse would willingly agree to host a radio broadcast. But this radio broadcast would have very anti-British propaganda on it. Given no real choice, Wodehouse agreed. However, the British were unhappy, and as a result, even though Wodehouse survived the war and escaped, he was never able to return to his home in Britain, lest he be prosecuted as a traitor. So what does this story show? It shows that even though he was one of the lucky ones, he wasn't majorly mistreated or killed, his life was still ruined by the Nazi invasion and his capture. But we can also see this in Star Wars. Many of the themes in Star Wars about the Imperials are closely tied to the Nazi Party. The sprawling architecture, the lines of troops, stormtroopers, I might add, taken from the name of the German army, are all direct references to the Nazi Party. And as a result, we now see the Nazi Party as evil. But even still, the soldiers were not necessarily, even if they were willing to admit that the Nazis were evil, were not always so certain if they were good themselves. War had been reduced to a business. As Winston Churchill said, combat has been reduced to a business like the stockyards of Chicago. End quote. No longer was there any strategy or planning involved. Well, there was, but not in the same degree. With nuclear weapons, you could just destroy cities with a single weapon. And in tactics like firebombing, did not focus on destroying all the infrastructure, but rather they created a ring of smoke which would drain out all the oxygen from the center, which would kill thousands of people. And the numbers of this show how effective these tactics were. Soviet Russia was responsible for 20 million deaths, and Nazi Germany for an additional 17 million. And this was devastating to all parties involved. With millions of people dead, was there any actual right side? Made people view evil as an ignorance that could be solved by education. If people were simply better educated, they would not turn to all these crimes. And that leads into our second point of how the world was reshaped in America's image. And this is seen mostly through the Marshall Plan. Now, George Marshall was an American general that after World War II had a plan to help Germany and other countries get back on their feet. He said, quote, "The remedy lies in breaking the vicious cycle and restoring the confidence of European people," end quote. How is he going to do this? Well, his plan made Reconstruction possible, and it transformed many foreign countries into avid supporters of Americans. The way he did this was mostly accomplished through America's vast resources. America was more than willing to give countries like Germany and Japan any sort of advice, in most cases any sort of monetary needs they might have, to help them quickly recover from all the damage inflicted by the Allies. As a result, after World War I, countries like Germany and Japan were in many cases in better spots than the other Allied powers such as Britain or France. But this does not mean they were completely beneficial to all of the population. War crimes were prosecuted in both Germany and Japan, and many of the higher-ups were executed or fled to other countries. Now, as a result, all this shows one clear thing, that this cycle of violence had been broken as all the people in charge were now dead or gone, and the country itself was now safely recovering in an industrial, American, and democratic fashion. Now, this last point is that it left permanent scars on the soldiers that fought in World War II. Now, after World War II, people had to deal with the trauma of what they'd done. And they dealt with it in many different ways. For either silence, alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, psychology, or joining cults. Perhaps the most confusing of those would be psychology. And this would be the much more scientific approach that many took after. As L. Ron Hubbard claimed that there were engrams, that they were the source of, quote, all psychological pain, which in turn harmed mental and physical health, end quote. This led to the rise of things like Dianetics and Scientology, and these were focused on addressing the psychology as to why people felt this pain, and saying it was purely the different result of different chemicals going wrong in the brain. Perhaps the most famous example, one of the most well-known examples of this is of A.E. Van Vogt. And in his book, Black Destroyer, he talks about how the evil monster was killing all the troops, all the men on the spaceship. However, they weren't entirely sure that it was him for the most part. They were stuck with a constant fear, a nagging guilt that was at the back of their mind all the time, as they knew something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out exactly what it was. And this is exactly what many of the soldiers felt after World War II. Strangers on the Train has a very similar plot, in that the main character, whose name I'm currently forgetting, he's dealing with a constant guilt that he might have had some part in his wife dying. And as this was exactly why so many turned to alcohol or drugs or cults to escape this guilt that they felt, regardless of whether or not they should have truly had it. But one of the last interesting ways they dealt with it is by, and we can see this is in the rise of suburbs. For after World War II ended, many returned home to wives, many of whom were hastily married as they were worried they might not come back. And with these wives, they decided to start families. Aided by programs like the GI Bill, this They quickly set up homes in new neighborhoods in an unprecedented manner that would soon define post-war America. This would become what we now have as suburbs, and the result of all these people wanting to rapidly start families after World War II caused these suburbs to pop up. But the reason for this, as I said before, is because they were trying to deal with the horrors that they had in World War II. As a result, we can see that World War II was not a simply good versus bad war. It was complex, and it led to a complete shift in our perspective of good and evil. The losers were compelled to imitate the winners or be destroyed, leading to a reconstruction of the world in America's image, and by it leaving permanent psychological scars on the victims that were fought in it.